Imagine standing beneath a sky that suddenly turns black at noon. The air grows heavy, the sun disappears, and then, without warning, the heavens explode. Fire rains down, seas boil, crops wither, and entire civilizations tremble in fear. For ancient peoples, these moments were not just disasters, they were messages from the gods, punishments, or battles between monsters beyond human comprehension. But what if those terrifying legends of dragons, giants, and wrathful deities were born from something far more real? Tonight, we journey into the eruption that set the world aflame, and inspired myths that still haunt us. On the morning of August 24th, in the year 79 CE, the world for thousands of Roman citizens living along the Bay of Naples changed forever. Mount Vesuvius, a mountain that had slept for centuries, erupted with a force so sudden and so overwhelming that it obliterated entire towns, buried them beneath meters of volcanic debris, and preserved them as silent witnesses for nearly 2,000 years. Pompeii, a thriving Roman city of about 12,000 residents, lay directly in the shadow of the volcano. Its streets bustled with merchants, tavern owners, artisans, and farmers who worked the fertile volcanic soil that had nourished vineyards and olive groves for generations. The people of Pompeii had no word for volcano as we use it today. The mountain was simply part of the landscape, majestic, immovable, and seemingly eternal. But Vesuvius was not eternal. Deep within the earth, pressure had been building for decades, perhaps longer. Magma pressed upward, gases accumulated, and the mountain grew restless. The first signs of trouble had come years earlier. In 62 CE, a powerful earthquake shook the region, damaging homes and temples. Repairs had been ongoing, even in 79 CE, with scaffolding still visible on many buildings in Pompeii. The people lived with the tremors, but few imagined that they were warnings of something far greater. We know what unfolded that fateful day because of one man, Pliny the Younger. At just 17 years old, he was staying at Misenum across the bay, in the company of his uncle Pliny the Elder, an admiral of the Roman fleet and one of Rome's greatest naturalists. From his vantage point, Pliny the Younger observed the eruption, and later described it in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus. His account remains one of the most detailed eyewitness records of any ancient natural disaster. Pliny wrote that around 1 in the afternoon, a cloud of unusual size and appearance rose from the mountain. It resembled a pine tree, he said, with a long trunk that expanded at the top into branching plumes. What he was describing was a towering Plinian column, a vertical eruption of ash, pumice, and volcanic gas that soared more than 30 kilometers into the sky. For the Romans watching from across the bay, it was a sight of terrible beauty, an awe-inspiring vision of the heavens torn open. At Pompeii, the first phase of the eruption was not fire but stone rain. Pumice and ash began to fall, first lightly, then in a continuous storm. Roofs collapsed under the accumulating weight. People fled into the streets, some clutching possessions, others abandoning everything in a desperate bid to survive. Archaeology has captured their choices. Bodies frozen mid-flight, jewelry still on their fingers, coins gathered in their hands. Some sought refuge in cellars, hoping the walls would protect them. Instead, many were crushed as the upper floors collapsed. Meanwhile, Pliny the Elder, ever the scholar and commander, decided to sail closer to investigate. As his ships neared the shore, he encountered chaos, pumice stones crashing into the sea, waves churning with volcanic debris, and terrified residents calling out from the beaches. Pliny attempted a rescue mission, but the falling ash and toxic gases forced many to abandon the effort. He would not survive the day, succumbing to the fumes on the shore near Stabia. His nephew's letters immortalized his bravery and curiosity, even in the face of death. As night fell, Pompeii was already unrecognizable. The sun had disappeared behind the choking column of ash, plunging the region into darkness as thick as midnight. Torches barely pierced the gloom. Survivors later described the sounds of collapsing roofs, the cries of neighbors, the rumble of the mountain. Panic was everywhere. The streets were clogged with debris and terrified crowds. But the true horror had not yet arrived. Early the next morning, the second and most lethal phase began. The pyroclastic surges. These were avalanches of gas, ash, and volcanic fragments racing down the slopes of Vesuvius at hundreds of kilometers per hour. At temperatures of up to 500 degrees Celsius, they incinerated everything in their path. Unlike the pumice fall, there was no chance of survival. Herculaneum, closer to the volcano than Pompeii, was one of the first to be overwhelmed. Archaeologists later uncovered hundreds of victims huddled in boathouses near the shore, their bodies instantly killed by the heat. The town itself was buried beneath nearly 20 meters of volcanic material, sealing its frescoes, scrolls, and homes in an airtight tomb. Pompeii endured several successive surges throughout the morning. The people who had survived the pumice fall and collapsed buildings now faced an inescapable wall of fire and gas. Entire families were found crouched together, clutching one another as the end came. Their last moments were seared into the hardened ash, leaving behind haunting plaster casts that today stand as some of the most powerful testaments to human mortality in the face of nature's fury. By the end of August 25th, Pompeii and Herculaneum no longer existed as living cities. Thousands were dead. The lush vineyards, farms, and villas of the Bay of Naples lay smothered beneath a grey wasteland. The eruption, lasting less than 2 days, altered the landscape forever. For centuries, the cities remained buried and largely forgotten. Medieval. Travelers who encountered the hardened layers of volcanic rock sometimes unearthed marble or inscriptions, but the scale of what lay beneath remained unknown. It was not until the 18th century, during the reign of Charles of Bourbon, that systematic excavations began. What archaeologists uncovered was astonishing. Entire streets frozen in time, mosaics intact, bread still in ovens, even graffiti scrawled on the walls. These ruins gave the modern world an unparalleled window into daily life in the Roman Empire and to the terror of the eruption itself. Victims were found where they fell, their possessions beside them. Some clutched oil lamps, others food, others religious amulets. Dogs, chained to doorways, were preserved in their final struggle. It was not only the destruction of a city, but the preservation of a moment in human history, captured with devastating clarity. The eruption of Vesuvius is now recognized as a Plinian eruption, a term derived from Plinian the Younger's account. Such eruptions are among the most violent on Earth, capable of expelling millions of tons of rock, ash, and gas into the stratosphere. They reshape climates, alter landscapes, and leave deep marks on human memory. For the Romans, the disaster was not just natural, but divine. Many saw it as punishment from the gods. Temples were destroyed, statues buried, and communities scattered. Yet life around the Bay of Naples eventually returned. The land, enriched by volcanic soil, drew settlers again. Vesuvius itself would erupt many times in later centuries, though none as catastrophically as in 79 CE today. The plaster casts of Pompeii's victims stand as silent figures, ordinary men, women, and children caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their preserved forms tell a story that no myth could exaggerate and no imagination could surpass. They remind us that nature, in its moments of unleashed fury, is both destroyer and historian. It buries, but it also preserves. It devastates, but it also reveals. The day the sky fell on Pompeii and Herculaneum was a day when human civilization collided with the raw power of the earth. It was a day when survival was measured in minutes, when decisions determined life or death, and when a mountain turned thriving cities into ghostly echoes. Thanks to the accounts of Pliny and the evidence sealed beneath ash, the story endures not as legend, but as a stark reminder of how fragile human existence is in the face of forces far older and greater than ourselves. Mountains have always inspired awe. Their size, their silence, and their seeming permanence gave them an almost divine quality to ancient peoples. But some mountains are different. They breathe smoke, shake the earth, and sometimes they awaken with devastating force. These are volcanoes, the sleeping giants of our planet. To understand eruptions, like Vesuvius in 79 CE, we must look deeper than the cities they destroyed. Beneath the calm slopes lies a vast geological system, one shaped by forces far older than human history. The Earth's crust is not solid and unbroken. It is fractured into enormous plates, drifting slowly over a molten mantle. Where these plates meet, clash, or pull apart, magma finds pathways upward. Over centuries, pressure builds, gases accumulate, and magma chambers swell. A mountain that seems still and silent is in fact alive with tension, waiting for the moment when it can no longer hold. The Romans had no concept of tectonic plates, magma chambers, or volcanic gases. For them, Vesuvius was simply a mountain, albeit one with a troubling reputation. Local farmers knew the soil was unusually fertile, ideal for grapes and olives. Philosophers noted the strange rocks scattered across its slopes. Ancient Greek settlers in the region had even told stories of giants buried beneath it, straining against the earth. They believed the fire that sometimes glowed from the summit was the breath of a trapped monster. To them, the mountain was a prison, holding forces too dangerous to be released. Modern volcanology has given these ancient fears a scientific explanation. Vesuvius, like many volcanoes around the world, sits near a tectonic boundary. The African plate is slowly pushing beneath the Eurasian plate, a process known as subduction. As the descending plate sinks into the mantle, water and other materials are released, melting the rock and creating magma. That magma is less dense than the surrounding solid rock, so it rises, collecting in chambers beneath the surface. When the pressure becomes unbearable, the mountain explodes. This is why volcanic eruptions are not random. They are the inevitable outcome of Earth's restless geology. Some volcanoes erupt frequently, releasing pressure in smaller bursts. Others may sleep for centuries, storing unimaginable energy. Vesuvius had been dormant for generations before 79 CE, lulling the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum into complacency. But Vesuvius is not unique. Across the world, similar giants slumber. Mount Fuji in Japan, Mount Etna in Sicily, Mount Aloha in Hawaii, and Krakatoa in Indonesia all are volcanoes shaped by the shifting plates beneath our feet. Each has its own cycle, its own temperament, and its own history of destruction. Ancient civilizations often tried to explain these phenomena through myth. In Hawaii, the eruptions of Mauna Loa and Klauia was said to be the work of Pele, the goddess of fire, whose anger could not be contained. In Greece, the fire of Mount Etna was thought to be the forge of Hephaestus, god of smiths, where he crafted weapons for the gods. In Norse tradition, the fire giants of Muspelheim were believed to dwell in fiery mountains, waiting for the end of the world. These stories were not simply superstition, they were cultural frameworks for understanding forces that defied human control. What volcanology shows us today is that myths often carried fragments of truth. When people described gods hurling fire or dragons breathing smoke, they were trying to make sense of the real phenomena they witnessed. The flames, the choking gases, the thunderous roars of eruptions, these were beyond explanation in the language of the time. Myth turned chaos into story. Scientific observation of volcanoes began only in recent centuries. After Vesuvius erupted again in 1631, scientists started to pay close attention. They studied the patterns of tremors, the chemistry of volcanic rocks, and the distribution of ash. By the 20th century, volcanology had become a discipline in its own right. Seismographs, satellite imaging, and gas spectrometers now allow scientists to monitor the signs of an impending eruption: swelling slopes, escaping carbon dioxide, and rising magma. Yet despite these advances, prediction remains difficult. Volcanoes are complex systems, and even today they defy complete certainty. The scale of their power is staggering. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with a force greater than any other in recorded history. It ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that global temperatures dropped, leading to the infamous year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed in Europe and North America, leading to famine and migration. The eruption not only reshaped landscapes, but also human societies thousands of miles away. In 1883, Krakatoa exploded with a blast heard nearly 3,000 miles distant, sending tsunamis across the Indian Ocean and killing tens of thousands. The eruption reduced the island itself to fragments. These events remind us that volcanoes are not just local threats, they are global forces, capable of altering weather, agriculture, and human survival on a planetary scale. A single eruption can plunge regions into darkness, disrupt trade, and transform politics. They are geological events with historical consequences. Vesuvius, though smaller in scale than Tambora or Krakatoa, became one of the most famous eruptions because of the human story preserved beneath its ash. The plaster casts of Pompeii show us the instant when lives ended. The letters of Pliny the Younger reveal the terror of witnessing a mountain tearing itself apart, and the ruins themselves show us how entire communities could be silenced in a matter of hours. But Vesuvius is not extinct. It remains active, with its last major eruption in 1944. During the chaos of the Second World War, today, millions live in its shadow, in Naples and surrounding towns. Volcanologists monitor it constantly, aware that another catastrophic eruption is inevitable. The question is not if, but when. The lesson of these sleeping giants is humility. For all our scientific progress, we remain vulnerable to the same forces that terrified the Romans, the Greeks, and the Polynesians. Our ancestors turned volcanoes into gods and monsters because they understood, in their own way, that humans are fragile in comparison. We may measure, monitor, and analyze, but when a mountain awakens, it reminds us that we are still guests on a restless planet. From the fertile soils they create to the cataclysms they unleash, Volcanoes are paradoxes of creation and destruction. They nourish civilizations, then bury them. They inspire myths, then confirm them with fire. And as long as Earth continues to move beneath our feet, these giants will never truly sleep. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, its fury unfolded in two distinct phases. The first, which buried Pompeii under a rain of pumice and ash, was terrifying enough. But what followed in the early hours of the next morning transformed the disaster. From catastrophe to apocalypse. Entire cities were consumed in minutes, landscapes were obliterated, and the lives of tens of thousands ended in silence and fire. To those who lived through it, it must have felt as though the world itself had caught fire. The second phase of the eruption unleashed pyroclastic surges of avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments that roared down the slopes of Vesuvius at speeds approaching 100 kilometers per hour. Temperatures inside these clouds reached between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius. They were unstoppable walls of death, capable of incinerating everything in their path. Unlike the pumice fall, where survival was at least possible through shelter or escape, no one caught in a pyroclastic surge had any chance. The first surges struck Herculaneum, the smaller but wealthier coastal town west of Vesuvius. Archaeologists discovered that as the surges rolled in, many inhabitants attempted to flee toward the shoreline. In the 1980s, excavations revealed more than 300 skeletons, crammed inside stone boathouses near the ancient beach. Mothers clutched infants, men shielded their families, and groups huddled together in desperation. Death came instantly as the superheated gases seared lungs and flesh within seconds. In some cases, the heat was so intense that bones cracked and skulls exploded from internal steam pressure. Above them, the surges transformed the city itself. Roofs and columns collapsed under the force. Wooden beams ignited instantly. The town was entombed beneath nearly 20 meters of volcanic deposit sand, entombment far deeper than Pompeii's. Ironically, this suffocating blanket of ash preserved Herculaneum's buildings, frescoes, papyrus scrolls, and wooden furniture in extraordinary detail. Though the lives inside were extinguished in an instant, Pompeii, situated further south, was struck. Later, by the time the surges reached the city, many of the survivors of the pumice fall had already abandoned their homes, trying to escape along the roads leading away from the volcano. Some likely made it, others were overtaken in the open. Archaeologists have found bodies sprawled along ancient streets and roadsides, frozen mid-flight. Inside the city, those who had remained in search of safety faced the same fate as their neighbors in Herculaneum. The surges swept through homes, temples, and bathhouses. Victims suffocated as the hot gases filled the air, or died instantly as the heat enveloped them. The plaster casts, created by archaeologists in the 19th century, revealed the details of their final moments. People crouching, covering their mouths, holding each other tightly. The outlines of their clothing, sandals, and even facial expressions are preserved in haunting clarity by the time the eruption ended. Pompeii lay buried under 4 to 6 meters of ash and pumice, its streets sealed, its walls silenced. Roof tiles, amphorae coins, and even food were trapped in place. Loaves of bread, carbonized in ovens. Dogs remained chained to doorways, their final struggle visible in preserved form. Life had been interrupted mid-sentence. The devastation extended beyond these two cities. Stabia, Oplantus, and other settlements around the Bay of Naples were also buried or heavily damaged. Estimates suggest that between 16,000 and 20,000 people perished during the eruption. The once thriving region celebrated for its villas, fertile fields, and coastal beauty was transformed into a wasteland of grey ash and silence. The destructive pattern of Vesuvius was not unique. Similar events have played out across history, each leaving its mark on humanity. In 1902, the Caribbean island of Martinique experienced the wrath of Mount Pelée. A pyroclastic surge raced into the city of St. Pierre, killing nearly 30,000 people in minutes. Like Pompeii, the victims were found frozen in place, life cut off mid-motion. Eyewitnesses described the city as being swallowed by a wall of fire. Only 2 people survived, one of them a prisoner protected by the thick walls of his cell. In 1883, Krakatoa erupted with such violence that the island itself exploded. The eruption generated colossal pyroclastic flows that sped across the sea, vaporizing everything they touched. The blast was heard thousands of kilometers away, and tsunamis devastated coastal settlements. More than 36,000 died, and the global climate cooled in the years that followed. These comparisons underscore the universal reality: when the earth releases its fury, no fortress or wall can protect those in its path. Whether in ancient Pompeii or 19th century Indonesia, pyroclastic surges embody the destructive heart of volcanic eruptions. But the destruction of Vesuvius was not only physical. The psychological toll must have been immense. Survivors who escaped carried with them memories of suffocating darkness, the deafening roar of collapsing roofs, the searing heat, and the cries of loved ones left behind. In Roman society, natural disasters were often interpreted as divine judgment. The eruption of Vesuvius struck at the heart of Roman confidence in their gods and empire. Entire communities disappeared, their temples buried, their prayers unanswered. Even in the aftermath, the devastation reshaped the region. Farmland was destroyed, trade routes disrupted, and local economies collapsed. Families who had fled lost homes, possessions, and ancestral ties. Refugees likely scattered throughout the Roman world, carrying stories of the day when the sky rained fire. For centuries afterward, the landscape bore the scars. Vesuvius itself remained active, erupting again in 203 CE, for 72 CE, and many times in the centuries to follow. Each eruption was smaller than that of 79 CE, but each reminded those living in its shadow of the mountain's fury. Modern excavations allow us to reconstruct the scale of the destruction in painstaking detail. Layers of pumice, ash, and pyroclastic material reveal the sequence of events almost hour by hour. Scientists can trace the flow of surges, the collapse of buildings, and the final desperate movements of people. Forensic analysis of bones tells us who they were, their ages, diets, diseases, and even occupations. Archaeology transforms the silent ruins into testimony. The destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, while tragic, left behind one of history's most complete records of ancient life and of sudden death. Nowhere else do we see so clearly how disaster can freeze a moment in time. In the plaster casts of Pompeii, we see not myth, but reality. Men, women, and children whose lives ended in a single moment, preserved by fire and ash. The phrase, "a world on fire," is not metaphorical. It is geological truth. In 79 CE, the world of Pompeii and Herculaneum literally ignited. Buildings collapsed in flames, the air itself burned lungs, and the land was remade. For those who survived, the memories must have lingered like shadows. For those who perished, Their final moments became part of history's most haunting archaeological record. Volcanic eruptions remind us of a fact both humbling and terrifying. Human civilization is built on the crust of a living planet. We farm the fertile soils created by eruptions. We build homes in the shadow of volcanoes. We drink wine from grapes nourished by volcanic minerals. And yet, at any moment, the ground beneath us can awaken and turn life into ash. The world of Pompeii was not the first to burn, nor the last. From Santorini in the Bronze Age to Tambora in the 19th century, humanity has faced the same reality. Again and again, volcanoes destroy, but they also preserve. They take lives, but they give us history written in ash. And in their silence, they remind us that another eruption is always waiting. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, its devastation was immediate and local. Cities were buried, thousands perished, and the Bay of Naples was forever transformed. But eruptions are not only local events. When a volcano is large enough, its impact can extend far beyond its slopes, beyond its valleys, and beyond the sight of those who witnessed the eruption. Its power can reach the atmosphere itself, spreading ash and gases across continents, dimming the sun and altering the very climate of the earth. Volcanic ash is not like the soft soot of a fire. It is composed of pulverized rock, glass shards, and mineral fragments ejected from the magma chamber with explosive force. Each particle is sharp, abrasive, and capable of lingering in the atmosphere for days, weeks, or even years. During the eruption of Vesuvius, the sky above Campania turned. Black day became night, and ash fell in choking waves. Eyewitnesses described the scene as an endless snow of stone and dust, piling on rooftops, burying gardens, and filling streets. The immediate effect was suffocation and collapse. Roofs caved under the weight of ash. People who tried to breathe through cloths found their lungs filled with fine particles, triggering fits of coughing and asphyxiation. For those trapped indoors, the air itself became unbreathable. Pliny the Younger wrote that even miles away at Mistinum, the ash grew so thick the torches could barely cut through the darkness. The air was heavy with sulfur, and people groped blindly through streets, fearing the earth had reached its end. While Vesuvius's ash devastated Campania, its reach was not global. But other eruptions have cast their shadows across the world. The most dramatic example came in April 1815. When Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded with a force 10 times greater than Vesuvius. The eruption sent more than 150 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Ash fell across the islands of Southeast Asia, turning midday into midnight. But the greater impact came from the invisible gases released. Tambora injected vast amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These tiny droplets reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the earth. In 1816, the world experienced what became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed in Europe and North America. Frost struck New England in June, killing corn and wheat. In Ireland, famine spread as potatoes rotted in the ground. In Switzerland, a group of young writers trapped indoors by unrelenting rain. Them, Mary Shelley and Lord Byron's, spent their time spinning tales of darkness and terror. Out of this unnatural climate was born Shelley's novel Frankenstein, a literary child of volcanic winter. The consequences of Tambora's eruption rippled through economies, societies, and cultures. Food shortages, triggered riots in Europe. Grain prices soared. Starvation claimed thousands of lives. Families migrated in search of arable land, reshaping demographics. The ash cloud had circled the globe, a reminder that a single eruption could alter the fate of nations. Krakatoa too left its mark on the skies. In 1883, its eruption sent ash and aerosols into the upper atmosphere, producing sunsets of stunning brilliance around the world. Observers in London and New York wrote of fiery red skies that lingered long after dusk, inspiring painters like Edvard Munch, whose famous work The Scream is thought to capture the eerie glow of Krakatoa's atmospheric haze. For years, the sun and moon appeared tinged with strange colors, testimony to the global reach of volcanic ash. Even smaller eruptions have left records in history and myth. The eruption of Santorini, Thera, around 1600 BCE, may have spread ash as far as Anatolia and Egypt. Some scholars argue that the widespread devastation contributed to the collapse of the Minoan civilization and may have inspired elements of Plato's Tale of Atlantis. Ancient texts from Egypt speak of a sky darkened, crops withering, and strange storms echoes, perhaps a volcanic ash disrupting regional climates. The science behind these global effects is clear. Large volcanic eruptions can propel material into the stratosphere, where it can remain suspended for years. Unlike weather in the lower atmosphere, which disperses particles quickly, the stratosphere is stable, allowing ash and aerosols to spread globally. These particles scatter sunlight, cooling the Earth's surface, sometimes by a degree or more. That may seem small, but even slight cooling can disrupt harvests, alter rainfall patterns, and extend winters. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, producing the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. Its aerosols cooled the Earth by nearly half a degree Celsius for several years. Modern technology allowed scientists to measure the effect precisely, confirming what history had long suggested. Volcanoes can change the climate of the entire planet. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum did not live to see such global consequences, but they experienced the local terror in full. For them, the ash turned day into night, transforming familiar landscapes into alien wastelands. Vineyards, olive groves, and orchards that had sustained generations disappeared beneath grey blankets of sterile dust. Rivers clogged with sediment. The fertile land of Campania, once called the Garden of Italy, was stripped of life in hours. For those who fled and survived, the world they returned to was unrecognizable. Their cities were gone, their fields unproductive, and their gods silent. The ash had rewritten the geography of their lives. Towns were buried, roads erased, coastlines altered. What had been home was now an ashen desert, whispering only of what had been lost. What makes volcanic ash uniquely destructive is its persistence. Unlike floods or earthquakes, which pass quickly, ash lingers. It poisons water supplies, crushes roofs, destroys crops, and corrodes metal. After modern eruptions, cleanup can take years. Air travel halts as engines risk being choked with abrasive dust. In the ancient world, recovery was even harder. Without modern infrastructure, entire communities could vanish beneath the weight of a single eruption, never to be rebuilt. And yet, ash is also a paradox. Over time, it nourishes the soil with minerals, creating some of the most fertile farmland on Earth. This cycle of destruction and renewal explains why people, ancient and modern, continue to live in the shadow of volcanoes. They gamble on the fertility of the land, hoping the giant beneath their feet will remain asleep. The myths that followed eruptions often captured the dual nature of ash-filled skies. In many cultures, stories speak of suns that disappeared, of endless winters, of gods casting veils across the heavens. Norse legends of Fimbulwinter, the great winter before Ragnarok, may echo memories of volcanic winters in the far north. In China, records of yellow fogs and failed harvests align with volcanic events identified in ice cores. For ancient peoples, the sight of a blackened sky and a sun that gave no warmth was nothing less than a divine omen. In the end, ash across the skies is both a scientific phenomenon and a human story. It is the record of how natural events ripple through societies, altering economies, inspiring myths, and even shaping art. From Pompeii to Tambora, from Krakatoa to Pinatubo, the lesson is clear. When the sky turns dark with ash, the entire world feels its shadow. When volcanoes erupt, they do more than destroy landscapes and bury cities. They leave an imprint on human imagination. For ancient peoples, the sight of fire bursting from the earth, the roar of mountains splitting open, and the sky turning black demanded explanation. With no knowledge of plate tectonics or magma chambers, they turned to the language of myth. From Greece to Polynesia, from Scandinavia to Mesoamerica, stories of gods, giants, and dragons carried the memory of eruptions. These myths were not mere fantasy. They were humanity's attempt to give shape to the monsters born of fire. In the Mediterranean world, Mount Etna in Sicily was one of the most fearsome volcanic mountains. Ancient Greeks believed that the giant Typhon, a monstrous creature with 100 serpent heads, was imprisoned beneath it. According to Hesiod, when Typhon struggled, flames and smoke erupted from the mountain, shaking the earth with his fury. The myth was more than a story, it was a cultural memory of eruptions and earthquakes in the region. Each new outburst was explained as the giant straining against his bonds. The forge of Hephaestus, god of fire and smiths, was also placed beneath Mount Etna. Myths described sparks and smoke rising from the mountain as the work of divine craftsmen, forging weapons for the gods. To the Greeks, volcanic eruptions were not random but tied to cosmic battles and divine labor. They gave human faces to the violent forces they could not control. Across the Roman Empire, similar associations emerged. Vesuvius, before its eruption in 79 CE, was already linked with Bacchus, the god of wine, because of the fertile vineyards on its slopes. But after the disaster, many Romans saw the eruption as divine punishment. Gods once seen as benevolent could also show anger, and mountains could be their instruments of wrath. Far from Europe, in the islands of the Pacific, volcanoes were central to cosmology. In Hawaiian tradition, the goddess Pele ruled over fire and volcanic activity. She was both destroyer and creator, capable of consuming villages with lava, but also of creating new land from cooled flows. Stories of Pele wandering the islands, her temper flaring in eruptions, reflected the lived reality of communities living on the slopes of active volcanoes like Mauna Loa and Klauia. To this day, eruptions in Hawaii are described in terms of Pele's Willa, living link between myth and geology. In Norse mythology, fire and mountains were bound to the end of the world. The fire giants of Muspelheim, led by Surtur, were prophesied to march across the world during Ragnarok, setting all ablaze. Their realm was described as a land of fire and molten rock, echoing the imagery of erupting volcanoes. For people of the far north, who may have witnessed distant volcanic eruptions or felt their climate effects, The idea of fire from the earth destroying the world became a powerful mythic theme. The connection between volcanic eruptions and monsters is also visible in East Asia. In Japan, Mount Fuji has long been revered as sacred. Ancient texts describe eruptions as signs of unrest among the gods or spirits. In some legends, fiery dragons were said to dwell beneath volcanoes, their breath emerging as smoke and flame. The imagery of dragons, creatures that breathe fire and live beneath mountains, closely mirrors the phenomena of volcanic activity. In Mesoamerica, volcanoes shaped myths of gods and heroes. The Aztecs told of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, two mountains near modern Mexico City, which were once lovers transformed into volcanoes. Popocatépetl, the warrior, breathes smoke in eternal mourning for his lost beloved. These stories reflected both the danger of eruptions and their emotional impact on the people who lived in their shadow. The link between eruptions and monsters often came from the sounds as well as the sights. When Krakatoa erupted in 1883, the explosions were heard nearly 3,000 miles away. Imagine what such a sound would have meant in a pre-scientific world, a roar without cause, shaking the earth, echoing across seas. Ancient peoples described such sounds as the cries of giants, the voices of gods, or the roars of dragons beneath the ground. Volcanic lightning, another phenomenon of major eruptions, also fueled myth. When ash clouds rise high into the atmosphere, friction between particles generates static electricity, producing flashes of lightning within the dark plume. To those who saw it, it looked as though the gods themselves were hurling thunderbolts. The imagery of Zeus in Greece, Thor in Scandinavia, and Indra in India, gods of thunder and lightning, may owe some of their terrifying power to the natural displays that accompanied eruptions. The psychological roots of these myths are clear. Humans need explanation. When confronted with overwhelming natural disasters, myth provided answers and warnings. Myths transformed random destruction into meaningful story, embedding lessons in cultural memory. Communities who told tales of fire gods and giants were also passing down warnings. The mountain is dangerous. Respect its power. Do not take the land for granted. Archaeological and geological studies support this idea. The eruption of Santorini around 1600 BCE was one of the largest in human history. The blast may have destroyed much of the Minoan civilization, crippling trade and agriculture across the Aegean. Scholars suggest that the story of Atlantis, told by Plato 1,000 years later, may echo memories of this eruption, an advanced civilization destroyed in a single day by fire and sea. What became myth may have begun as history. Similarly, global myths of darkness, the sun disappearing, endless winters, or gods covering the sky may preserve the memory of volcanic winters. The Norse Fimbulwinter, the Chinese records of yellow fogs, and even biblical descriptions of plagues of darkness align with known volcanic events. Myth becomes not only story but archive, carrying fragments of geological truth across generations. Even today, the imagery of volcanic eruptions feeds modern myths and monsters. When Krakatoa's sunsets turned skies blood red in the 1880s, they inspired apocalyptic visions in art and literature. When Tambora's eruption plunged the world into cold and famine, it gave rise to Gothic tales of death and resurrection. The fire-breathing monsters of fantasy fiction echo the same imagery that ancient peoples used to describe the terror of mountains exploding. The birth of monsters, then, is not just metaphor, it is cultural memory. Volcanoes gave rise to myths of dragons, giants, gods of fire, and apocalyptic battles because they embodied destruction on a scale humans could neither control nor ignore. By turning eruptions into stories, people found meaning in chaos, and in doing so, they created legends that have endured long after the ash settled. Volcanoes still shape myth today, but with science, we can also trace their origins. What was once the breath of a dragon is now the exhalation of sulfur gases. What was once the anger of gods is now understood as tectonic plates colliding. But the myths remain powerful, reminding us that behind every story of fire and monsters lies a moment when the earth itself seemed alive. For ancient peoples, the earth itself was alive. Mountains rose like the bones of gods, storms carried divine voices, and fire belonged to the realm of the sacred. When volcanoes erupted, their violence was too immense to be dismissed as natural chance. To many civilizations, the fire and smoke were messages. The gods were speaking, sometimes in anger, sometimes in warning, sometimes in demand. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE was interpreted by Romans not only as a natural disaster, but also as a divine judgment. Temples and statues were buried alongside homes and markets, giving the impression that the gods themselves had been swept into the catastrophe. Survivors sought explanations in religion. Some saw the eruption as punishment from Vulcan, the god of fire and the forge. Others saw the wrath of Jupiter, king of the gods, who hurled fire and ash as weapons. In Roman culture, disasters were often read as prodigiomens that required ritual atonement. Priests would have consulted oracles and performed sacrifices to interpret and appease divine anger. The connection between volcanoes and divine will stretched far beyond Rome. In the eastern Mediterranean, Mount Etna in Sicily became central to religious imagination. The Greeks and later the Romans placed the forge of Hephaestus, or Vulcan, beneath its slopes. Every eruption was explained as the sparks of divine labor. When Etna roared, it was the hammering of the gods. The myth was both explanation and reassurance. The chaos had meaning. It was tied to the work of immortals. In Hawaii, the goddess Pele embodied fire, lava, and volcanoes. She was not only feared but revered. When Kloya or Mauna Loa erupted, Hawaiians believed Pele was making her presence known. Ritual offerings were left for her flowers, food, and chants to honor her power. Legends told of her fiery temper, consuming villages, but also her gift of creation, as cooled lava expanded the islands themselves. Pele was not merely a destructive force, she was part of the cycle of life and renewal. For Hawaiians, eruptions were divine communication, reminding them of their place in a living landscape. In Japan, Mount Fuji carried profound spiritual weight. Shinto traditions regarded the mountain as the dwelling place of deities, particularly Konohana Sakuhaime, the goddess of blossoms. When Fuji erupted, as it did most notably in 864 CE, it was taken as a disruption of the sacred balance between humans and the kami, the spirits of Shinto belief. Pilgrimages, prayers, and rituals were ways of restoring harmony. The Japanese word for volcano, Kazon Fire Mountain, reflects this fusion of nature and spirit. Among the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures, volcanoes were tied to gods of creation and destruction. Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the twin volcanoes overlooking the Valley of Mexico, were wrapped in legends of love, death, and transformation. Their smoke was interpreted as a sign of the gods' restless presence. Aztec priests performed rituals atop pyramids, offering sacrifices to maintain cosmic balance. An eruption was not just geological, it was cosmic communication, demanding response. In Christian Europe, volcanic eruptions were often interpreted through the lens of divine punishment. The eruption of Laki in Iceland in 1783 poisoned the air with sulfur dioxide, creating what came to be known as the Laki haze. Crops failed across Europe, famine spread, and thousands died. In France, peasants and clergy alike interpreted the disaster as a sign of God's anger against a sinful world. Sermons declared the haze a warning of judgment. Some historians suggest that the famine and despair that followed Laki's eruption contributed to the unrest that fueled the French Revolution. In this sense, the divine interpretation of volcanic disasters even shaped political upheaval. Similarly, in 1815, when Tambora erupted in Indonesia, creating the year without a summer, many communities interpreted the strange cold, failed harvests, and darkened skies as divine displeasure. In New England, farmers prayed for forgiveness, believing their sins had brought unnatural frost. In Europe, preachers spoke of apocalypse. For many, the idea of the earth itself rebelling could only be explained as God's voice thundering through creation. The connection between volcanoes and ritual extended to sacrifice. In Andean civilizations, volcanic peaks were often sacred sites. The Inca built shrines on mountain summits, leaving offerings of gold, textiles, and even human lives to appease the gods believed to dwell within. The frozen remains of sacrificial children discovered near volcanic peaks in the Andes revealed the seriousness of these rituals. To the Inca, eruptions and earthquakes were not accidents of geology, but messages from the mountain deities, demanding devotion. The duality of volcanoes, destroyers and creators, reinforced their religious power. Fertile volcanic soils fed communities. Vineyards thrived on Vesuvius's slopes before its eruption. Rice paddies flourished in Java's volcanic valleys. People depended on volcanoes for survival, even as they feared their wrath. This tension made volcanic mountains natural sites of worship. They were both givers and takers of life. Volcanic phenomena themselves resembled divine acts. The thunderous roar of an eruption sounded like the voice of a god. Lightning within ash clouds resembled divine weapons. Pyroclastic flows, moving faster than a horse could run, looked like armies of fire sent by deities. The very scale of eruptions seemed supernatural. In cultures around the world, it was only natural to interpret such events as direct communication from powers beyond human comprehension. Modern science has revealed the mechanics behind eruptions, but even today, the sense of awe remains. In 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, residents described the sky darkening as if the end of the world had come. For weeks, sunsets glowed blood red. Even with scientific explanation, the imagery echoed ancient descriptions of gods casting fire into the heavens. The experience of standing beneath a volcanic eruption is so overwhelming that the language of myth still feels appropriate. When God spoke through fire, people listened. They built shrines, offered sacrifices, changed laws, and even launched wars under the belief that divine will had been revealed. Volcanic eruptions shaped not only landscapes but cultures, politics, and religions. They reinforced the idea that humans lived at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. Across history, eruptions became turning points. They could end civilizations, inspire migrations, or spark revolutions. They also shaped theology, embedding in sacred texts and oral traditions the idea that fire from the earth was divine speech. Whether through Peele, Hephaestus, or the God of the Bible, humanity has long believed that when the sky rains fire, the message is meant for us. Even in the modern age, the symbolism endures. Volcanoes appear in literature, cinema, and art as metaphors for divine judgment, suppressed anger, or cosmic power. The myths created thousands of years ago still resonate because the raw experience of eruption has not changed. A mountain exploding remains one of the few events that can make humans feel both fragile and profoundly connected to forces beyond themselves. Volcanoes, in their silence and their fury, remind us of the dialogue between Earth and humanity. To ancient peoples, the dialogue was religious, a conversation with gods. To us, it is scientific, a study of tectonic plates and gases. Yet the awe is the same. When gods spoke through fire, they gave birth to myths, rituals, and civilizations that continue to echo in our world. When volcanoes erupt with unimaginable force, they do more than bury cities and silence valleys. They can shake the foundations of entire civilizations. From the collapse of the Minoans in the Aegean to the famine-stricken empires of Asia, volcanic eruptions have repeatedly proven themselves to be turning points in human history. They destabilize economies, redirect migrations, and inspire myths of civilizations that vanished overnight. The destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 CE, though tragic, was only a fragment of Vesuvius's power. The Roman Empire, vast and resilient, absorbed the loss. But in other moments, volcanic disasters were not so easily contained. In some cases, they pushed whole societies to the brink of survival, and, in others, they ended them entirely. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples is the Thera eruption, also known as the Santorini eruption, around 1600 BCE, located in the Aegean Sea. The volcanic island of Thera exploded with such force that much of the island collapsed into the sea, creating a vast caldera. Ash deposits from the eruption have been found as far away as Egypt and Anatolia. The eruption produced towering tsunamis that swept across the Aegean, devastating coastal settlements. The Minoan civilization, centered on Crete, bore the brunt of this catastrophe. The Minoans were a powerful maritime society, their fleets dominating trade across the eastern Mediterranean. But the eruption crippled their harbors, buried farmland under ash, and disrupted trade routes. Some scholars argue that the Minoans never fully recovered. Within a century, their dominance waned, and Mycenaean Greeks rose to power. The legend of Atlantis, as recorded by Plato 1,000 years later, may echo this collapse, a great civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day. In the Roman world, Vesuvius's eruption was not enough to destabilize the empire, but it demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most advanced societies. Wealthy villas vanished, trade routes were disrupted, and agricultural output in Campania was wiped out. Rome endured, but the eruption served as a reminder that natural disasters could humble even the greatest powers. The most catastrophic eruption in recorded history came in 1815, when Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded with a force unmatched. In human memory, the eruption killed tens of thousands outright, burying villages beneath pyroclastic flows and tsunamis. But its most far-reaching effect was global. Sulfur aerosols spread through the stratosphere, reducing global temperatures by nearly a degree. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Across Europe and North America, crops failed. In Switzerland, snow fell in June. In New England, Frost struck in July. Famine gripped communities from Ireland to China. Grain prices soared, sparking riots. Thousands migrated in search of food. Historians now recognize Tambora as one of the great triggers of the 19th century's political and social upheavals. Some have even linked it indirectly to the rise of new ideologies and mass movements born out of desperation and hunger. Earlier still, in 1257, the eruption of Somala's volcano in Indonesia blanketed the globe with ash and aerosols. Its effects have only recently been recognized through ice core analysis. The eruption caused severe famines across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Chroniclers in England describe summers without warmth, failed harvests, and a failure of the fruits of the earth. In Japan, records speak of strange skies and shortages. The eruption, though largely forgotten in memory, left scars across continents. Volcanoes have destabilized civilizations in more subtle ways as well. The Loki eruption in Iceland in 1783 lasted for 8 months, releasing vast amounts of sulfur dioxide. Poisonous haze drifted across Europe, killing crops and livestock. In France, famine followed, fueling discontent that would erupt in revolution just 6 years later. While the causes of the French Revolution were complex, the ecological disaster of Loki played its part in pushing a society already strained by inequality into open crisis. Volcanoes have also reshaped empires in Asia. In 946 CE, the eruption of Mount Paektu on the border of modern North Korea and China produced one of the most powerful explosions of the last 2 millennia. Ash fell across Japan, Korea, and China. Chronicles describe strange red skies, thunderous noises, and years of climatic disruption. For the kingdoms of the region, the eruption coincided with political upheavals, migrations, and wars, leaving a permanent imprint on East Asian history. For Andean civilizations, volcanoes were central to both life and death. The Inca Empire revered volcanoes as sacred. Yet, eruptions repeatedly devastated their communities. Archaeological evidence shows entire settlements abandoned in response to volcanic events. Ash layers in the Andes reveal cycles of destruction and resettlement, forcing the Inca and their predecessors to adapt constantly to a volatile landscape. The connection between volcanic disaster and civilization's fragility is perhaps clearest when we consider food. Agriculture is the foundation of societies, and volcanic eruptions threaten it directly. Ash buries fields, poisons rivers, and kills livestock. When eruptions are large enough to affect climate, entire harvest cycles fail. Societies built on delicate agricultural balances can collapse within a single season of famine. But while eruptions can destroy, they also create opportunities. Volcanic soils, rich in minerals, are among the most fertile in the world. That is why people repeatedly return to live in volcanic regions, despite the danger. The Minoans thrived on the fertile islands of the Aegean. The Romans cultivated the slopes of Vesuvius. The Javanese farmed the land around Krakatoa and Merapi. Civilizations rise on volcanic land because it sustains them until the day it destroys them. The long-term lesson is sobering. Human history has often been shaped by forces beneath our feet. Empires rise and fall, but beneath their grandeur lies a restless earth. When the balance tips, a single eruption can undo centuries of progress. Modern science has revealed just how fragile our global civilization remains. If a super-eruption on the scale of Tambora or Thera occurred today, the effects would be catastrophic. Globalized agriculture, trade, and infrastructure would all feel the impact. A volcanic winter could disrupt food supplies for billions. History teaches us that civilizations at the brink often find themselves pushed over by fire from below. The stories of Pompeii, Thera, Tambora, Lucky, and Krakatoa remind us that volcanoes are not just local disasters. They are engines of historical change. They have toppled kingdoms, weakened empires, and rewritten the trajectory of societies. They remind us that human civilization, for all its achievements, rests on fragile ground. Volcanoes are both destroyers and creators of history. They bring fertility and ruin, wealth and famine. They sustain civilizations until, one day, they unmake them. Again and again, they have forced humanity to adapt, migrate, and rebuild. And again, they have left us myths of lost civilizations, swallowed by fire and sea. For the Minoans, it was Atlantis. For the Romans, it was Pompeii. For the 19th century, it was the year without a summer. Each was a moment when a volcano reminded humanity that no empire, no civilization, no society is immune to the forces of the earth. Some disasters vanish from memory within a generation. Others are remembered for centuries, passed down in stories that evolve into legends. And then there are those rare cataclysms, so vast, so traumatic, that they echo for millennia into myths, scriptures, and folklore long after the event itself is forgotten. Among these, few stand as tall as the eruption of Thera, on the island now known as Santorini. Around 1600 BCE, the eruption of Thera was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. Geologists estimate that it was several times more powerful than Vesuvius in 79 CE and rivaled or exceeded Krakatoa in 1883. When the volcano exploded, much of the island collapsed into the sea, creating a massive caldera. Ash clouds rose tens of kilometers into the atmosphere, while tsunamis radiated outward across the Aegean, battering coastlines from Crete to Anatolia. For the Minoan civilization based on Crete, the eruption was devastating. The Minoans were a maritime power, their fleets dominating trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. Their wealth was built on agriculture, commerce, and cultural exchange. But Thera's eruption disrupted everything. Ashfall damaged crops, harbors were destroyed by tsunamis, and trade networks fractured. Within a century, the Minoan world had declined, leaving space for the rise of Mycenaean Greece. The disaster did not fade into silence. Instead, it may have been preserved in story. Over 1,000 years later, the philosopher Plato wrote of Atlantis, a great and advanced civilization that was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Scholars have long debated whether Plato's tale was pure allegory or based on cultural memory. Some suggest that the memory of the Minoans and the destruction of Thera filtered down through oral traditions, inspiring the story of Atlantis. The parallels are striking. A powerful seafaring people destroyed suddenly by natural catastrophe, leaving ruins beneath the waves. Thera's eruption may also have influenced stories far beyond Greece. In Egypt, papyrus texts describe a time when the sky grew dark, the Nile ran red, and famine spread across the land. Some scholars have speculated that these accounts, together with biblical narratives of the plagues of Egypt, could reflect memories of volcanic fallout. While this link remains debated, the idea highlights how one eruption could ripple across cultures, reshaping myth and scripture. What made Thera so mythically potent was not only its scale but its sensory impact. Imagine the sky darkening for days, the sea retreating and then surging back as walls of water, the earth trembling and the air choked with ash. For Bronze Age societies with no scientific framework, such events could only be explained through divine or supernatural causes. Myths were the language of survival, encoding lessons and fears into stories that could be passed on. Vesuvius, too, echoed in myth and legend long after 79 CE, while Rome survived. The haunting destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum became symbols of divine wrath. Christian writers in later centuries interpreted the eruption as a judgment against pagan Rome, comparing it to the biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The preserved ruins of Pompeii, rediscovered in the 18th century, only deepened this association. Visitors saw frozen figures in ash and took them as moral warnings. The wages of sin were fire from the earth. Other eruptions similarly became mythic touchstones. The 1815 eruption of Tambora, though modern, created legends of its own. In Europe, the year without a summer gave rise to apocalyptic sermons, visions, and literature. The bleak climate inspired Gothic imagination, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Lord Byron's Darkness channeling the sense of a sunless world. Tambora's eruption became more than history. It became cultural myth, shaping art and thought in ways far removed from Indonesia's shores. The echoes of volcanic disasters and myth also appear in Norse tradition. The Fimbulwinter, a long and brutal winter that would precede Ragnarok, has been interpreted by some as a memory of volcanic winters. Ash-darkened skies and failed harvests could easily inspire legends of an endless cold heralding the end of the world. Likewise, in Chinese chronicles, accounts of yellow fogs and blood-red suns align with known volcanic events, linking mythic imagery to geological reality. The blending of myth and eruption is not coincidence. It is the human attempt to make sense of chaos. When the sun vanishes behind ash clouds, when seas rise without warning, when fire pours from mountains, the ordinary boundaries of life collapse. Myth restores meaning. It frames disaster as story punishment from gods, battles of giants, or the downfall of proud civilizations. In this way, the memory survives. Long after the specifics are lost, archaeological evidence reinforces the scale of Thera's impact. Ash deposits on Crete show layers of devastation. Frescoes preserved in Krakatoa, the buried city on Santorini, reveal a flourishing culture suddenly silenced. Tree rings and ice cores confirm climatic disruption across the globe. The event was not only local but planetary. And yet, because written records were scarce in the Bronze Age, the memory survived through oral tradition, reshaped into legends that endured. The same pattern emerges again and again. Catastrophe becomes myth. Myth becomes tradition. Tradition influences history. The eruption that destroyed Thera may have indirectly inspired Plato's tale of Atlantis, shaped Egyptian and biblical stories of darkness and plague, and echoed in Aegean memories of gods punishing mortals with fire and sea. In the end, the eruption of Thera teaches us something profound about memory. Natural disasters fade quickly in the landscape. Ash erodes, vegetation returns, ruins are buried. But in human imagination, they endure. They are retold, reshaped, reinterpreted, until they become myths of monsters, gods, or lost civilizations. And though the myths may bend truth, at their heart lies a real event. A day when the sky darkened, the sea rose, and a world was remade in fire. Long before disasters were written into chronicles or measured with seismographs, they were preserved in memory. Communities that faced volcanic eruptions turned survival into story, embedding warnings, lessons, and awe into folklore. These tales, passed down through generations, became part of cultural identity. They were not just myths, they were survival strategies, ensuring that the memory of fire and ash would never be forgotten. In the Pacific Islands, volcanic folklore is particularly rich. For the Hawaiian people, the goddess Pele embodied the living presence of the volcanoes. Oral traditions describe her fiery temper, her battles with her siblings, and her power to create and destroy. When lava flows reached villages, elders told stories of Pele's anger and reminded their communities of the need to respect her. These tales served not only as spiritual narratives, but as practical warnings. Never ignore the mountain. Never underestimate the fire. Even today, when Kilauea erupts, many Hawaiians describe it in terms of Pele's will. In New Zealand, the Maori developed traditions around volcanic landscapes like Mount Taranaki and the Taupo region. The Great Eruption of Lake Taupo around 232 CE, one of the most powerful eruptions of the last 2 millennia, may be reflected in Mbori oral history. Legends speak of great fires and darkness that spread across the land. While the myths are framed in spiritual terms, modern geology recognizes in them echoes of real eruptions, whose effects would have been unforgettable to those who lived through them. Among the indigenous peoples of North America, stories also carry volcanic memories. The Klamath people of Oregon tell of a battle between the sky god, Skell, and the underworld god, Lau. Their war destroyed a great mountain, which collapsed to form what is now Crater Lake. Modern science confirms that about 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama erupted catastrophically, leaving behind the caldera that became Crater Lake. The Klamath story, preserved for thousands of years, is one of the oldest known accounts of a geological event. It demonstrates how oral tradition can carry the memory of catastrophe across deep time. In Iceland, sagas and folklore often reference volcanic activity. The eruption of Elja around 939 CE, one of the largest in Europe in the last millennium, poured lava across the land and darkened skies across the northern hemisphere. Icelandic poetic texts like Völuspá speak of fire surging, the sun darkening, and the world trembling. Scholars believe these passages reflect memories of volcanic eruptions reframed in mythic prophecy. Fire and folklore became inseparable. In a land defined by volcanic landscapes, in Japan, Mount Fuji's eruptions inspired centuries of legends. Folklore described the mountain as a spiritual gateway, its eruptions seen as messages from kami, or divine spirits. Poems and songs often referenced fiery skies and falling ash. Communities living near Fuji carried forward rituals of reverence, ensuring that stories of past eruptions would not fade. These stories preserved the memory of danger while reinforcing cultural respect for the mountain. Volcanic folklore was not always about destruction, it also explained renewal. In Java, where fertile volcanic soils sustain millions, stories describe volcanoes as both givers and takers of life. Farmers knew the risks, but returned to the slopes generation after generation. Folklore described eruptions as reminders of divine power, balancing gratitude for fertile land with fear of sudden loss. In Mesoamerica, volcanic legends were woven into cosmology. The Aztecs told of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the warrior and the princess transformed into mountains. When Popocatépetl smokes, it is said he still watches over his beloved. This story, while romantic, also reinforced the visible presence of the volcano as an active, living force. Communities built rituals around such legends, acknowledging the mountain's role in their lives and deaths. What unites these traditions is their ability to carry memory across centuries without writing. Folklore is resilient. It adapts, it changes, but it keeps the core of experience alive. In the Pacific, songs and chants described the sound of eruptions. In Iceland, sagas captured the imagery of fire and ash. In the Americas, legends framed eruptions as battles of gods or lovers. Each form was different, but the purpose was the same: to remember, to warn, to explain. Modern science has repeatedly confirmed the accuracy hidden within folklore. The Klamath story of Crater Lake matches geological evidence of Mount Mazama's eruption. Tambora stories of darkness and fire align with the Topo eruption. Even Norse tales of Fimbulwinter may carry traces of volcanic winters. These examples show that folklore is not simply imagination, it is data encoded in narrative, carrying the truth of lived experience through generations. For survivors, telling stories was a way of coping with trauma. Fire falling from the sky, entire villages buried, families lost. These were experiences too vast to carry in silence. Folklore gave form to grief, transforming it into narrative. In telling and retelling, communities found meaning. The story preserved not just the facts, but the emotions, the fear, the awe, the reverence for forces beyond human control. Folklore also served as education. By embedding warnings in myth, communities ensured that future generations would treat volcanoes with respect. A story about an angry goddess, a slain giant, or a smoking warrior was easier to remember than geological details. Children grew up hearing these tales, absorbing lessons about where to build, when to flee, and how to honor the land. Even in the modern era, volcanic folklore continues to shape perception. In Indonesia, communities around Mount Merapi hold annual ceremonies to honor the spirits of the volcano. The ritual, known as Labohan, involves offerings of food and cloth cast into the crater. While scientists monitor Merapi with seismographs and satellites, locals still look to folklore to guide their relationship with the mountain. The two systems, science and tradition, coexist, both born from the same need to understand and survive. Folklore, like ash, spreads far. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 generated global legends. The blood-red sunsets it produced inspired apocalyptic imagery in art and literature. Newspapers sensationalized the event, blending fact and fiction into stories of islands vanished and seas on fire. Within years, Krakatoa had entered folklore not only in Indonesia but across Europe and America. A modern myth of fire and ruin. The persistence of fire in folklore shows how deeply volcanic events imprint themselves on culture. They are unforgettable experiences, reshaped into narratives that survive where ruins decay. In folklore, the fire never goes out, it continues to burn in the words, songs, and imaginations of those who inherit the stories. In the end, folklore is a form of resilience. It keeps memory alive, warns of danger, and connects communities to their past. Through stories of gods, giants, and lovers, ancient peoples carried forward the truth of eruptions, that the earth is alive, that fire can rise from beneath our feet, and that survival depends on remembering. When mountains erupt, the spectacle is beyond comprehension. Skies darken, fire rises from the earth, and the air itself becomes lethal. For ancient peoples, and even for us today, Such forces demanded meaning, again and again across cultures. Eruptions were personified as monstrous giants buried beneath mountains, dragons breathing fire, gods hurling thunderbolts. These myths reflected more than imagination. They revealed the human mind's attempt to externalize inner terror, to turn overwhelming natural forces into recognizable forms. In the birth of these monsters, we see not only geology, but psychology. The sight of a volcano erupting overwhelms human senses. The roar of explosions drowns out voices. The sky turns black at noon, broken only by lightning flickering in ash. Clouds, rocks rain from above, the ground shakes, and heat scorches the air. For those who witnessed these phenomena, it was not enough to describe them as accidents of nature. Human psychology demands agency. Something must be causing this chaos. If the mountain moved, then something inside the mountain must have willed it. This is where monsters were born. In Greek mythology, the giant Typhon was imprisoned beneath Mount Etna. His struggles shook the earth. His fiery breath scorched the sky. In Norse mythology, Surtur and the fire giants would one day rise to consume the world. In Japan, dragons beneath mountains exhaled fire. In Polynesian tradition, goddesses like Pele expressed their anger through lava flows. These monsters were not random inventions, they were personifications of the overwhelming sensory assault of eruptions. Psychologists describe this as anthropomorphism, the projection of human traits onto non-human phenomena. When confronted with incomprehensible danger, the human mind turns it into something familiar, even if terrifying. A dragon or a giant is at least a form with motives, emotions, and narratives. A column of ash 30 kilometers high has no face, no voice, no story. But if it is the work of a god or monster, it can be explained, feared, appeased, or worshipped. The imagery of monsters also reflects deep human archetypes. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung argued that certain figures recur across cultures because they embody universal aspects of the human psyche. Fire-breathing beasts, giants beneath the earth, and gods of destruction may represent what Jung called the shadow, the embodiment of human fear, chaos, and death. Volcanic eruptions gave physical form to these archetypes, turning inner anxieties into external realities. In many cultures, volcanic monsters also served as moral symbols. In Rome, Christian writers later interpreted the eruption of Vesuvius as divine punishment against paganism, echoing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Hawaii, Peel's wrath was seen as a warning to respect the land and its balance. In Norse myth, Surtur's fiery destruction was not random but part of a cosmic cycle leading to renewal. By giving eruptions a moral framework, societies transformed natural terror into ethical teaching. The psychology of monsters also reflects the need for control. If a volcano is simply random, nothing can be done. But if it is the anger of a god, a sacrifice or ritual might help. If it is a monster, perhaps it can be appeased, resisted, or endured. This belief, however illusory, gave people a sense of agency. Even in despair, they could act offering prayers, gifts, or rituals to influence forces larger than themselves. Archaeological evidence confirms this. In the Andes, the Inca performed sacrifices on high volcanic peaks, leaving offerings of gold, textiles, and even children. In Japan, shrines were built near Mount Fuji to honor the kami of the mountain. In Indonesia, ceremonies are still held around Mount Merapi, where offerings are thrown into the crater. These practices show that monsters and gods were not abstract. They were living presences, integrated into community life. Modern psychology helps explain why these patterns repeat across time and culture. Volcanic eruptions trigger profound existential anxiety. They remind humans of mortality, fragility, and the limits of control. By turning eruptions into monsters, the mind manages that anxiety. It is easier to live with a dangerous god than with meaningless chaos. Monsters, even deadly ones, provide structure. Interestingly, modern science has not erased these psychological patterns. During the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the United States, eyewitnesses described the blast as apocalyptic and monstrous. Journalists used imagery of dragons and hellfire. Even with seismographs and satellite data, the language of myth returned. This suggests that the human mind instinctively reaches for mythic metaphors when confronted with overwhelming natural forces. The persistence of volcanic monsters also reflects the human relationship with fire. Fire is both life-giving and destructive. It warms homes, cooks food, and sustains civilization, but uncontrolled, it devastates. Volcanoes are fire in its most uncontrollable form, and so they became the ultimate embodiment of ambivalence. The fire god is both creator and destroyer, the dragon both guardian and killer. In these figures, humans projected their complex feelings about fire itself. The monsters within eruptions also served a practical purpose: memory preservation. A story of a giant beneath a mountain is easier to pass down than geological detail. If children are told that the dragon will breathe fire if the mountain is angered, they learn caution. Myth encoded survival strategies. This is why indigenous stories like the Klamath legend of Crater Lake preserved accurate memories of eruptions for thousands of years. The monster was not just fear, it was a mnemonic device, a way of ensuring no one forgot what the earth could do. The monsters within us also explain why volcanic imagery resonates so deeply in art and culture. From medieval depictions of hell with fiery mountains to modern fantasy dragons, the imagery of volcanoes persists. Tolkien's Mount Doom in The Lord of the Rings is a clear echo of volcanic archetypes. The dragon's smog breathes fire like a living volcano. These modern creations are not new, they are continuations of an ancient psychological pattern. But perhaps the most revealing truth is this: the monsters were never only outside. They reflected the fears within. Volcanic eruptions made people confront mortality, loss, and helplessness. By giving those feelings external form, humans could face them. Typhon, Surtur, Peel, dragons, and fire gods were not just explanations of geology, they were mirrors of the human soul in crisis. Even today, as we watch eruptions through the lens of science, we still describe them as monstrous. We speak of volcanoes angrily awakening, of mountains devouring towns, of skies spitting fire. The language of monsters is still with us. It is the way we bridge the gap between the cold mechanics of geology and the overwhelming reality of standing beneath a sky filled with fire. Volcanoes gave us monsters because the human mind needs them. They are symbols of chaos, death, renewal, and survival. They turn the incomprehensible into story, the terrifying into memory, and the uncontrollable into meaning. And in doing so, they reveal that the greatest monsters are not buried beneath mountains, but within the human imagination itself. For centuries, myths were treated as fantasy, the imaginative fabric of pre-scientific peoples. Stories of gods beneath mountains, fire-breathing dragons, and endless winters were dismissed as superstition. But modern volcanology has revealed something remarkable. Many of these legends carry within them real geological truths. The boundary between myth and science is not as clear as once believed. Ancient storytellers, without knowing it, were also historians of the earth. One of the most striking examples lies in the American Pacific Northwest. The Klamath people of Oregon preserved a story for thousands of years about the origin of Crater Lake. According to their oral tradition, the underworld god Lao battled the sky god Skell. Their war shook the earth, spewed fire, and finally collapsed. A great mountain, creating the deep blue lake that still lies there today. Modern geology confirms that about 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama erupted catastrophically, emptying its magma chamber and collapsing into a vast caldera now filled by Crater Lake. The myth preserved not only the event, but key geological details: the fire, the collapse, the birth of the lake in the Mediterranean. Myths of giants and gods around Mount Etna and Vesuvius reflect similar observations. The Greeks described Typhon, a monstrous figure buried beneath Etna, whose struggles caused fire and smoke. Today, volcanologists understand that Etna is one of the world's most active volcanoes, with frequent eruptions of lava and ash. What the Greeks described as Typhon's breath was volcanic gas. His struggles were tremors. His fiery rage, lava, fountains. Myth was metaphor, but it was built on consistent observation of real phenomena. The Norse myth of Fimbulwinter offers another compelling example. In sagas, Fimbulwinter was a great and terrible winter lasting 3 years, a prelude to Ragnarok. Scholars long debated whether this was symbolic or based on real events. In the late 20th century, ice core studies revealed evidence of massive volcanic eruptions around 536 CE, likely in Iceland or Central America. These eruptions spewed enough ash into the atmosphere to cause global cooling, crop failures, and widespread famine. Contemporary records from China, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East describe dim skies, strange weather, and suffering. The Fimbulwinter may well be cultural memory of this climatic catastrophe. The Thera eruption around 1600 BCE, one of the most powerful in human history, provides further evidence of myth rooted in fact. The blast devastated the Aegean and may have contributed to the decline of the Minoan civilization. Plato's later tale of Atlantisan, advanced civilization destroyed in a single day by fire and sea, bears uncanny similarities. While not all details align, many scholars believe that memories of Thera's destruction filtered down through oral traditions, eventually inspiring the Atlantis myth. Even the imagery of dragons may encode volcanic memory. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, dragons are often described as living beneath the earth, breathing fire, and emerging with thunder and smoke. Volcanologists note the parallels. Volcanic vents spew smoke and flame. Tremors rumble like growls, and eruptions roar like monstrous bellows. While dragons never existed, their traits mirror the natural features of volcanoes. The mythic beast may be an imaginative personification of real geological experience. Science has also explained volcanic lightning, once thought to be the weapons of gods. When ash clouds rise into the atmosphere, friction between particles generates static electricity, producing spectacular bolts of lightning. Ancient myths of gods hurling thunderbolts during eruptions, from Zeus in Greece to Thor in Scandinavia, may reflect eyewitness accounts of this phenomenon. For a people without electrical theory, lightning in ash clouds could only be divine. In Japan, Eruptions of Mount Fuji were long linked to divine displeasure. Shinto shrines were built to honor kami associated with the mountain. When Fuji erupted in 864 CE, chronicles described lakes boiling, rivers flooding with lava, and skies filled with ash. These descriptions, framed in religious language, match geological reconstructions of the event. The anger of the gods was in fact the release of pressure in a magma chamber, but the mythic framework preserved accurate memory of what the eruption did to the land. The Andean peoples of South America also encoded volcanic reality in ritual and myth. The Inca regarded volcanoes as sacred, dwelling places of powerful mountain deities. They performed sacrifices at high-altitude shrines, leaving offerings that archaeologists have since uncovered. Modern science confirms that eruptions repeatedly devastated settlements in the Andes, forcing migrations. The rituals were not only spiritual, they were responses to real danger. Myths of divine mountain lords demanding sacrifice reflected attempts to understand and survive recurring catastrophe. Modern methods like ice core sampling, dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, and archaeological excavation have given us the tools to compare myths with real events. Again and again, the parallels are striking. Stories of endless night, failed crops, and monstrous battles align with evidence of volcanic winters. Myths of sun gods vanishing or skies turning red align with atmospheric effects of ash and aerosols. Legends of floods or seas rising often follow volcanic-triggered tsunamis. Even the biblical narrative of the plagues of Egypt has been linked by some scholars to volcanic activity. Ash clouds could darken skies, contaminated water could appear blood-red, and falling ash could devastate crops. While such connections remain debated, they underscore how myths and scriptures may carry faint echoes of geological events. The convergence of science and legend shows that ancient peoples were not naive. They observed carefully, remembered vividly, and encoded their knowledge in stories. Myth was their way of recording history, long before writing or geology existed. Where we see monsters, they saw memory. Where we see allegory, they saw survival. The rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum underscores this point. Pliny the Younger's eyewitness account, long considered unique, is now matched by the archaeological record. His descriptions of ash, falls, pyroclastic surges, and suffocating darkness align precisely with modern volcanology's understanding of Plinian eruptions. The science validated the story and the story preserved the science. Science does not diminish myth. Instead, it enriches it. When volcanologists trace the layers of ash in Greenland's ice core and match them to sagas of darkness, they reveal how human imagination has always been tied to natural truth. When archaeologists uncover offerings on Andean volcanoes, they show how ritual embodied scientific observation. Eruptions repeat, and the mountain must be respected. When anthropologists compare dragon myths across continents, they highlight the shared human need to explain fire from the earth. The lesson of science meeting legend is that myth is not mere fiction. It is cultural memory of real events, refracted through imagination, religion, and storytelling. Beneath the monsters and gods, there is geology. Beneath the allegories, there is history. And beneath the legends, there is truth. Volcanoes created monsters and gods, but they also created storytellers. And those storytellers, without seismographs or satellites, left us accounts that still resonate. Science now confirms what myth preserved, that the earth has always spoken in fire, and humanity has always listened. When the fires subside and the ash settles, what remains is silence. Cities lie buried, landscapes transformed, and countless lives lost. Yet history is not only the story of destruction, it is also the story of those who survived. After volcanic disasters, survivors faced the immense challenge of rebuilding their worlds from ruins. Their resilience, choices, and cultural adaptations became legacies passed down to future generations. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE annihilated Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other towns along the Bay of Naples. Tens of thousands perished, but others escaped. Refugees from Campania fled to nearby cities such as Naples, Capua, and Rome. For them, survival meant starting anew with nothing but the clothes they carried. Ancient records are sparse, but evidence suggests that many survivors were absorbed into surrounding communities. Families lost property, status, and homes, yet they endured, carrying the memory of that day. Roman law even addressed the aftermath. Some land deeds near Pompeii include notes of abandonment following the eruption. The empire, vast and resource-rich, could absorb the refugees, but at the human level, the trauma endured for generations. In contrast, in smaller societies, the loss of land or a city could destabilize entire cultures. The Minoan civilization suffered not only destruction from the Thera eruption, but also disruption of trade and agriculture. Archaeological evidence shows settlements abandoned, pottery styles shifting, and power centers relocating. Survivors had to adapt to diminished resources and fractured networks. Within a century, Mycenaean Greeks dominated the region. The Minoans did not vanish overnight, but their survivors were absorbed, transformed, and assimilated into new cultures. Their legacy lived on in myths and art, even as their independent civilization disappeared in the Andes. Where eruptions were frequent, survival meant adaptation to a volatile environment. The Inca and their predecessors treated volcanic peaks as sacred, performing rituals to maintain balance with the mountain deities. Archaeological evidence reveals communities destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly on volcanic slopes. Survivors migrated, resettled, and adjusted farming techniques. Volcanic soils, though dangerous, were too fertile to abandon. The legacy of survival in the Andes was not avoidance, but resilience. Learning to coexist with recurring catastrophe, the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 provides one of the most dramatic examples of survival on a global scale. On the island of Sumbawa, tens of thousands died in the immediate blast and its aftermath. Yet beyond Indonesia, millions experienced famine, migration, and hardship during the year without a summer. In Europe, survivors coped with food shortages by turning to new strategies. In Germany, the potato became a staple crop because it could withstand cooler temperatures better than grain. In New England, desperate farmers abandoned their lands, fueling westward migration into the American frontier. In Switzerland, where endless rains fell, a group of young writers endured confinement by telling stories, producing works like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Survival, in this case, was cultural as well as physical. Humanity endured, adapted, and even created art from darkness. The Loki eruption in Iceland in 1783 offers another example. The eruption spewed toxic gases, killing livestock and devastating crops. A quarter of Iceland's population perished in the famine that followed. Yet survivors rebuilt in the centuries after, continuing to inhabit a land defined by fire and ice. Their resilience was rooted in adaptation, learning to diversify food sources, migrating when necessary, and embedding the memory of disaster into folklore and tradition. The sagas and stories that arose became survival tools, warnings encoded. In culture, resilience was not only practical but also spiritual. Survivors turned to ritual, religion, and myth to make sense of their survival. In Hawaii, after eruptions destroyed villages, survivors held ceremonies for Pele, offering respect to the goddess who both destroyed and created. These rituals gave survivors a sense of meaning, transforming trauma into relationship with the divine. In Japan, pilgrimages to Mount Fuji became a way to connect with the sacredness of survival itself, reinforcing cultural ties to the mountain even after eruptions devastated communities. In Europe, volcanic disasters often fueled religious fervor. After the eruption of Loki, many interpreted the haze as God's wrath. Churches filled with prayers for deliverance. Some turned to apocalyptic prophecy, convinced the end was near. Yet faith also provided strength. Rituals, sermons, and processions gave survivors a framework for endurance. Even when material conditions were dire, survivors also left legacies in material culture. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum shows attempts to salvage valuables, carry coins, and preserve jewelry even in final moments. In Tambora's aftermath, survivors left written accounts of famine and migration, which now serve as historical testimony. In Iceland, sagas and poems describe the missed hardships of Loki, preserving the survivors' perspective for future generations. These records, whether written or oral, are part of humanity's collective survival, ensuring the memory of catastrophe endures as warning. Survival also reshaped political landscapes. After Tambora, widespread famine strained governments across Europe. In France, already destabilized by revolution and war, grain shortages triggered unrest. In Ireland, volcanic-induced crop failures added to existing poverty, intensifying migration. Survival was not just individual, but collective, influencing nations and empires. At the psychological level, survival often came with trauma. Modern studies of volcanic disasters show high rates of anxiety, depression, and cultural dislocation among survivors. It is likely that ancient survivors carried similar scars, though expressed through myth and ritual rather than medical diagnosis. Folklore of wrathful gods, monsters, and endless winters may have been one way of processing trauma, externalizing inner fear into communal story. Yet survival also fostered ingenuity. In regions repeatedly struck by eruptions, people developed warning systems long before seismographs in Java. Villagers learned to recognize rumbling sounds, sulfur smells, or changes in animal behavior as signs to flee. In Italy, Roman writers like Pliny the Younger described the stages of eruption in detail, creating one of the first naturalist accounts of a volcanic disaster. These observations were part of the survivor's legacy, knowledge preserved to protect future generations. Even in the modern era, survival after eruptions has inspired global cooperation. The eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991 forced the evacuation of tens of thousands, but modern monitoring saved countless lives. Survivors rebuilt communities with international aid, turning tragedy into an opportunity for scientific advancement and resilience. The legacy here was technological as well as cultural, the development of better monitoring systems that continue to protect millions worldwide. The survivor's legacy, then, is not only endurance, but transformation. Communities adapted economically, spiritually, politically, and scientifically. They preserved memory through folklore, reshaped diets and migrations, invented new strategies of warning, and built cultures that carried both the scars and the lessons of fire. When we look back at the ruins of Pompeii, the legends of Atlantis, or the writings of Tambora's famine years, we see not only destruction, but the persistence of life. Survivors carried memory forward. They ensured that the fire would not be forgotten, that the warnings would be heeded, and that resilience would endure in every eruption. The dead are remembered in ruins, but the survivors are remembered in culture. They are the reason we know these stories at all. They are the bridge between destruction and history, and their legacy is the greatest testimony to humanity's ability to endure, even when the world itself seems to fall apart. When volcanoes erupt, their immediate fury is unmistakable lava flows, collapsing cities, skies raining ash, but their most profound impact often comes not in hours or days, but in the months and years that follow. Large eruptions can inject immense amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where particles scatter sunlight and cool the planet. Crops wither, seasons shift, and societies that once thrived are brought to their knees. In these moments, when the sun dims and the air chills, the world itself seems to stand still. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 remains the most devastating example in recorded history. Located on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, Tambora's explosion ejected nearly 150 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The eruption darkened skies across the region, killed tens of thousands outright, and triggered tsunamis that swept coastal villages. But the true global catastrophe came in the following year. In 1816, the world experienced the infamous year without a summer. Across Europe and North America, the weather turned strange and hostile. Snow fell in New England in June, frost struck crops in July. In Ireland, unrelenting rain drowned potatoes in their fields, sparking famine. In Switzerland, endless storms forced families indoors for weeks. Grain harvests failed across the continent, leading to food riots, mass migration, and starvation. The cooling was global. China suffered crop failures that led to widespread unrest. In India, monsoons were disrupted, contributing to one of the worst cholera outbreaks in history. The world had entered a volcanic winter, a climatic pause caused by Tambora's aerosols reflecting sunlight back into space. The social and cultural consequences were immense. In Europe, famine sharpened tensions already simmering after the Napoleonic Wars. Families left their homes in search of food, reshaping migration patterns. In the United States, desperate farmers abandoned New England and moved westward, accelerating the settlement of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Out of hunger came new frontiers. The year's strange atmosphere even entered art and literature. The blood-red sunsets inspired painters like J.M.W. Turner, whose canvases captured the eerie skies left by Tambora's aerosols. In a villa on Lake Geneva, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and their companions, trapped indoors by constant rain, entertained themselves with ghost stories. From this dark summer came Shelley's Frankenstein, a tale born of volcanic winter. Tambora was not the only eruption to freeze the world. In 1257, the Semalas volcano in Indonesia erupted with nearly equal force. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show massive sulfate deposits from that year. Chronicles across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia describe bitterly cold summers, failed harvests, and famine. In England, chroniclers recorded a failure of the fruits of the earth. In Japan, Texts speak of strange skies and food shortages. Though the name of Somalis was forgotten, its shadow stretched across continents. Earlier still, in 536 CE, humanity endured what some historians call the worst year to be alive. Byzantine chroniclers wrote that the sun gave off its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, and famine spread from Ireland to China. Recent studies suggest that a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, was the cause. A second eruption in 540 compounded the devastation. The volcanic winter contributed to economic collapse in Europe and Asia, and may have weakened populations before the outbreak of the Justinian plague, one of history's deadliest pandemics. For those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of days. Even myths may carry the memory of these volcanic winters. The Norse legend of Fimbulwinter, a 3-year winter before Ragnarok, may echo the global cooling of the 6th century. In China, records of yellow fogs and dying crops mirror volcanic effects. For people without modern science, the disappearance of the sun and the collapse of agriculture could only be explained as cosmic punishment or divine upheaval. The consequences of volcanic winters were not only physical but also political. When crops fail, governments falter. After the Loki eruption in Iceland in 1783, sulfur dioxide clouds spread across Europe, causing harvest failures and famine. In France, already strained by inequality and debt, the hunger contributed to unrest. Within a few years, the French Revolution erupted. Volcanoes, in their silence, can help spark revolutions. In Asia, similar patterns emerged. The 1600 eruption of Huayna Patina in Peru cooled the global climate and devastated crops in Russia. The following years saw the Russian famine of 1601 to 1603, which killed more than 2 million people and weakened the Tsardom. Political instability followed, leading to what Russians call the Time of Troubles. The chain of events from eruption to famine to political crisis shows how volcanic winters could alter the fate of nations. For survivors, these periods of darkness and cold must have felt like time itself had stopped. The rhythms of planting and harvests were broken. Communities huddled indoors, waiting for warmth that never came. Sunsets turned blood red, the moon glowed strangely, and the air grew heavy with haze. In such conditions, people turned to myth, religion, or revolution. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in volcanic stillness. Modern science explains these phenomena with precision. When eruptions inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the gas reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These droplets reflect sunlight, reducing the amount of energy reaching the Earth's surface. The cooling can last for months or years, depending on the eruption's scale. While temperatures may drop only a degree or two, the effects on agriculture are catastrophic. Shortened growing seasons, disrupted rainfall, and unexpected frosts destroy harvests, leaving millions vulnerable. In our interconnected world, a similar event today would be devastating. Globalized food supply chains, though advanced, remain vulnerable to shocks. A Tambora-scale eruption could disrupt harvests on multiple continents simultaneously. Famine, migration, and political upheaval would likely follow, just as they did in centuries past. The lessons of history are clear. Volcanic winters are not relics of the past, but potential futures. Yet there is also resilience in these stories. Survivors endured, adapted, and rebuilt. Farmers shifted crops, communities migrated, and cultures produced new art, religion, and philosophy in the wake of disaster. Volcanic winters may have slowed the world, but they also shaped it. The migrations of New England farmers, the rise of new ideologies in Europe, the myths of endless winters in Norse traditional are legacies of times when the sun dimmed and the earth stood still. When the world stood still, humanity faced its limits, but it also discovered its endurance. The volcanic winters of 536, 1257, 1600, 1783, and 1816 remind us that civilization is fragile yet adaptable. The skies may darken, the harvests may fail, but humanity endures them from the silence of volcanic stillness. History moves forward once again. Every generation that has lived in the shadow of a volcano has faced the same question: how do we live with fire? From Pompeii to Tambora, from Santorini to Krakatoa, eruptions have shown us that our civilizations rest on fragile ground. Yet, people return to volcanic slopes, rebuild on fertile soils, and plant their fields in volcanic ash. The cycle of destruction and renewal is as old as humanity itself. Modern science gives us tools to understand these forces, but the lessons of history still demand humility. In 1883, the eruption of Krakatoa demonstrated the global reach of volcanic power in the modern age. On August 27th, a series of massive explosions shattered the island between Java and Sumatra. The blast was so loud it was heard nearly 3,000 miles away in Australia and India. Pressure waves circled the globe multiple times, recorded on barometers. In far-off nations, entire villages were swept away by tsunamis, killing more than 36,000 people, but the destruction did not stop at Indonesia's shores. Krakatoa's eruption injected ash and gases high into the atmosphere, altering skies worldwide. For months, sunsets glowed a brilliant red and purple. Painters like Edvard Munch captured the eerie light in works such as The Scream. Climate cooled, harvests failed in some regions, and global shipping routes were disrupted. Newspapers across the world carried daily reports, turning Krakatoa into the first truly international media event of a volcanic disaster. The lesson was clear: no eruption is only local. The effects of one mountain can ripple across oceans and cultures almost a century later. In 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state brought these lessons into the heart of modern America. Scientists had warned of activity in the weeks leading up to May 18th, but when the eruption came, it defied expectations. An earthquake triggered a massive landslide, removing the mountain's north face. The sudden release of pressure caused a lateral blast, flattening forests across hundreds of square kilometers. 57 people died, among them volcanologist David A. Johnston, who had been monitoring the site. His last radio message, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it," became a tragic marker of the eruption's suddenness. Mount St. Helens taught scientists that eruptions could be far more complex than simple vertical explosions. Lateral blasts, landslides, and pyroclastic flows showed the need for greater understanding and preparedness. It also revealed how human settlement in volcanic regions creates risk. Logging camps, homes, and highways lay in the path of destruction. Nature had once again reminded us that mountains are unpredictable giants. In 1991, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines provided both devastation and lessons in preparedness. For centuries, Pinatubo had been quiet, its slopes covered with forests and farms. When activity began in early 1991, Scientists from the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, working with the United States Geological Survey, monitored the mountain closely. They measured gas emissions, seismic activity, and ground deformation. Their warnings led to the evacuation of tens of thousands of people before the massive eruption on June 15th. Pinatubo's eruption was colossal, second only to Tambora in the last 200 years. It ejected 10 cubic kilometers of material, darkening skies and producing pyroclastic flows that buried villages. Ashfall collapsed roofs across Luzon, while Aha's volcanic mudflows continued to devastate valleys for years afterward. Yet the timely evacuation saved countless lives. Though more than 800 people died, the death toll could have been far higher without scientific monitoring. Pinatubo proved that science, when heeded, can turn knowledge into survival. The eruption also had global consequences. Sulfur dioxide from Pinatubo reached the stratosphere, lowering global temperatures by nearly 0.5 degrees Celsius for several years. Scientists were able to measure the cooling effect in detail, confirming the role of volcanoes in shaping climate. Pinatubo became a natural experiment that deepened our understanding of both volcanic processes and climate change. From these modern eruptions, several lessons emerge, lessons already foreshadowed by history. The first is that volcanoes are global events. Tambora, Krakatoa, and Pinatubo each reshaped not only their local landscapes, but also the atmosphere of the entire Earth. Ancient myths of darkened skies and endless winters were not exaggerations, but cultural memories of real phenomena. The lesson is that humanity cannot treat volcanic disasters as isolated. They are part of a planetary system that binds us all. The second lesson is that preparedness matters. Pompeii's residents had no concept of volcanic hazard. The Minoans could not have predicted Thera's fury. But today, with seismographs, satellite imagery, and gas sensors, we have tools to anticipate eruptions. Pinatubo showed that evacuations save lives. Mount St. Helens showed that hazards are varied and complex. The challenge is not only scientific, but also social, ensuring that communities trust warnings. Governments act quickly, and populations understand the risks. The third lesson is humility. For all our technology, volcanoes remain unpredictable. Even today, scientists cannot forecast the exact timing or scale of an eruption. Mountains may sleep for centuries and then awaken in days. Human hubris, the belief that we can master nature, is repeatedly humbled by fire and ash. The ruins of Pompeii, the empty villages of Tambora, and the ash-choked valleys of Pinatubo remind us that survival depends on respect for forces beyond our control. The fourth lesson is resilience. Civilizations return to volcanic lands because the soil is fertile. The slopes sustain life, and the benefits outweigh the risks until disaster strikes. The survivors of Locke rebuilt their farms. The people of Java returned after Krakatoa. Today, millions live near Vesuvius, Etna, Merapi, and dozens of other active volcanoes. Human resilience is remarkable, but it also reveals our dependence on volcanoes. They are not only destroyers, but also givers of life. These lessons carry urgency in the modern world. Our global population is larger than ever, with megacities built near active volcanoes. Naples lies under the shadow of Vesuvius. Mexico City sits near Tokyo is within reach of Mount Fuji. A major eruption in any of these regions could threaten millions. Beyond local devastation, a super eruption like Tambora could disrupt global food supplies in an interconnected economy, triggering crises. On a scale unseen in history, the history of volcanic eruptions also informs our understanding of climate. By studying past events, scientists learn how aerosols affect temperature, rainfall, and agriculture. This knowledge not only prepares us for future eruptions, but also deepens our understanding of human-driven climate change. Volcanoes, in their catastrophic violence, provide data that helps us see the fragility of Earth's systems. And yet, the deepest lesson may be cultural. Myths, folklore, and religion all arose from humanity's encounters with volcanic fire. They gave us stories of gods, monsters, and divine punishment. Today, science offers a different language, but the awe remains. When we watch footage of lava fountains or ash clouds billowing into the stratosphere, we feel the same mixture of fear and wonder that inspired our ancestors. The lesson of fire is that nature shapes us, not only physically, but also imaginatively. Volcanoes are teachers of humility, resilience, and respect. As the 21st century continues, volcanologists warn that another great eruption is inevitable. The question is not if, but when. When it comes, the lessons of history must guide us. The global reach of eruptions, the need for preparedness, the humility to respect uncertainty, and the resilience to rebuild. Volcanoes are not simply geological phenomena, they are forces that have shaped civilizations, religions, art, and science. They are destroyers and creators, terrors and teachers. And if we are wise, we will listen to the lessons they have left in ash, stone, and memory. For as long as humans have walked the earth, we have lived in the shadow of fire. Volcanoes have taken lives, buried cities, toppled civilizations, and reshaped climates. Yet they have also created fertile soils, new lands, and myths that endure. Through millennia, they are the paradox at the heart of our world. Destroyers and creators, feared and revered. As history has shown, they are not only natural phenomena, but forces that shape the destiny of humanity. The story of Pompeii and Vesuvius is perhaps the most haunting reminder of volcanic destruction. In a single day, a flourishing Roman city was silenced, its people preserved in ash. But the same volcano that ended Pompeii also gave life. For centuries before 79 CE, the fertile soils of Campania produced wine, olives, and grain that sustained generations. Even today, the land around Vesuvius is renowned for its agriculture. The fire that kills also nourishes. This duality is repeated across the world. In Indonesia, the slopes of volcanoes like Merapi and Krakatoa are densely populated. Despite the risks, the soils are rich, the harvests abundant. Generations accept the danger because life in volcanic valleys is bountiful. In Hawaii, Peel's lava flows destroy villages, but they also extend the islands, creating new land where once there was only sea. For Polynesian voyagers, volcanic islands were both home and sacred creation. In Iceland, eruptions like Loki in 1783 devastated communities, killing livestock and plunging the island into famine. Yet Icelanders returned, rebuilt, and continued to farm on volcanic ground. The geothermal energy of their volcanoes now powers much of the nation, turning destruction into sustainable life. What was once only feared has become a source of strength. Volcanoes also forge culture. The myths of Typhon beneath Etna, Peel in Hawaii, Surtur in Norse myth, and dragons across Asia all show how fire from the earth shaped human imagination. These stories were not simply entertainment, they were cultural memory, carrying warnings and lessons. They transformed terror into narrative, ensuring that eruptions were never forgotten. In the myths, volcanoes became gods, monsters, or symbols of divine judgment. In the science of today, they are studied as geological phenomena, yet the awe remains unchanged. They also forge history. The eruption of Thera reshaped the Aegean world, contributing to the decline of the Minoans and inspiring the legend of Atlantis. Tambora in 1815 reshaped global climate, triggering famine, migration, and cultural shifts from Europe to America. Krakatoa in 1883 transformed art and science alike, filling skies with colors that inspired painters and forcing scientists to reconsider the reach of atmospheric change. Again and again, volcanoes have reminded humanity that our civilizations are not masters of the earth, but participants in its cycles. The eternal flame of volcanoes is also the flame of resilience. Survivors of eruptions, whether Roman refugees, Icelandic farmers, or Filipino villagers after Pinatubo, show humanity's capacity to endure. They rebuild, adapt, and remember. The ruins of Pompeii are a grave, but they are also a museum, a place where the dead speak across millennia, reminding us of fragility. The people of Java live in the shadow of Merapi, not because they are blind to danger, but because they understand that risk and reward are inseparable. The legacy of survivors is a lesson in courage. Modern volcanology carries this legacy forward. By monitoring gas emissions, seismic tremors, and ground deformation, scientists can now predict eruptions with greater accuracy. These tools save lives, as in Pinatubo in 1991. Yet the unpredictability of volcanoes remains. We cannot stop them. We can only learn to listen. The lesson is humility. The earth is alive, and its forces are beyond complete mastery. Volcanoes also remind us of time on a scale far greater than human history. Civilizations rise and fall in centuries, but volcanic cycles span millennia. Santorini erupted in the Bronze Age, Krakatoa in the 19th century, Pinatubo in the 20th, and in each case, the earth reminded us that its rhythms are older and larger than our own. The eternal flame burns with or without us. As we look to the future, volcanologists warn of the possibility of a super-eruption events larger even than Tambora or Thera, Yellowstone in the United States, Toba in Indonesia, and Campi Flegrei near Naples are all capable of eruptions that could devastate global civilization. Such events are rare, but history tells us they will come again. The question is not if, but when. The eternal flame waits. And yet, even as we acknowledge the danger, we cannot escape the gifts. Volcanic soils feed millions. Volcanic landscapes inspire art, faith, and identity. Volcanic energy provides renewable power. Volcanoes shape migration, economy, and imagination. They are inseparable from the human story. The eternal flame is therefore not only destructive, it is creative, renewing, and enduring. It is the fire that buried Pompeii and the fire that gave Campania its vineyards. It is the ash that killed crops in Europe and the ash that fertilized rice fields in Java. It is the fire that inspired myths of monsters and the fire that fuels modern science. It is terror and wonder in equal measure. As this journey through history shows, volcanoes are not simply backdrops to human events. They are central characters. They speak through destruction, whisper through fertile soils, and echo through myths. They remind us that the earth is not inert, but alive, its heart burning beneath our feet. The eternal flame is our inheritance and our challenge. To live with volcanoes is to live with paradox, danger and abundance, death and renewal, silence and fury. It is to know that the ground we till can rise against us, and that the mountain we revere can also bury us. Yet it is also to know that humanity endures, learns, and remembers. Volcanoes will erupt again. Cities may fall, skies may darken, and winters may return. But survivors will endure. They will tell stories, rebuild homes, and plant new fields. They will pass down memories in myth, in science, in art, and in doing so, they will ensure that the eternal flame continues, not only in mountains, but in humanity itself. For in every eruption, we see both our fragility and our strength. We see that we are small against the earth, but also that we endure against its greatest forces. The eternal flame burns on beneath mountains, within myths, and in the resilience of the human spirit.